So, okay, again, I'll try to encourage people to come up, be part of the circle at any level. And one of the things that I wanted to do actually at the sort of pragmatic end of this discussion before we dive back into the theoretical, and to take advantage of Will Dow's mentioning this opportunity, which is that there is actually some pilot funding potential related to ideas. And one of the reasons to start with that, not only because he has to leave early, and I wanted to get him to talk about this a little bit, but also because there's the pragmatic side to this, which is like it's wonderful to exchange ideas and be creative and integrative with this fascinating interdisciplinary group and say, where are the exciting opportunities? But it's another to say, okay, well then what would be a next step? What would be a pragmatic pilot study that might move that idea forward? And there could be some opportunities to support pilot studies that could come out of this discussion. So it'd be nice to step to that pragmatic level for a moment, Will, since you offered to talk about that.
Yeah, so I think that it's really important to, while we're all here, to really push you all to think about, are there opportunities for getting together some of folks who may not have otherwise pulled yourselves together to make that next step to developing some new project. So we have two centers on campus that are potentially have pilot funds to help support sort of innovative new work. One of them is CEDA, the Center for the Economics and Demography of Aging, which I direct. It's NIA funded, and a big part of its reason for existence is to seed small studies which are sort of highly innovative, hopefully multidisciplinary, and this is a great group for that, and hopefully which have the potential for developing into some sort of larger study, which might be sort of funded R1, R21, or something like that. And from CEDA's perspective, being NIA funded, it's particularly interested in understanding how sort of economic and health behaviors and decision making sort of might be changing over the life course. So understanding some of those sort of mechanisms about how those things sort of are changing is important. Or testing sort of very theory-driven applications. So those of you who have sort of applied work and ideas, all right, let's take some of these hypotheses, theories to the data and think of innovative interventions. So if you have ideas for piloting such interventions to actually test hypotheses. So for example, there's work which we're supporting around smoking commitment contracts, and this could be work around sort of savings. It's in lots of different dimensions that CEDA would be interested in. There's a second mechanism on campus through the Berkeley Population Center, which I help direct as well, and that's NICHD funded, so it doesn't need to be aging related necessarily. So this can be on sort of other populations, more adolescents and sort of younger individuals who we're talking about, although both centers take a life course perspective to what they're doing. So the point being that if you have interesting ideas that could use some funding, CEDA generally funds things sort of $10,000 and up, up to $70,000 or so. It can be very sort of meaty pilots. Typically there will be a Berkeley co-PI sort of involved in those. But if there's some unique circumstance, let me know anyway. If you have something smaller that maybe would be through the XLab Mobile, we can help sort of funnel money through sort of XLab Mobile as well to help support things and make them happen. So as you guys have ideas, let me know, and I'm happy to talk about what the possibilities might be. But these are things that I hope you can come up with ideas in the next 2 days and forward them to me right away, because we know empirically we all procrastinate, and they won't happen if we don't make it happen now. So XLab is the Experimental Social Science Laboratory on campus. So there's a laboratory here on campus sort of for bringing in people, so doing sort of controlled experiments in sort of more traditional sort of psychology kind of format. But there's another version of that, XLab Mobile, which has been developed here on campus, which will develop apps for people who want to actually take an intervention to sort of cell phone-based kind of platform. And it may be something that is where individuals would be putting in their sort of alcohol, whatever data on a daily basis, or it could be prompts that are sent out by text to individuals, and it can also be linked to GPS. So you might actually know when someone walks into a store that's selling liquor, and you could have a text come to them So that technology exists today, and so we're sort of helping people and trying to really spur some innovative new proposals to use that functionality. So, so my name again is Will Dow. My email is wdow@berkeley.edu. You can go through these guys if you forget who I am, and they'll they'll help connect us. Thanks.
So why don't we start or follow up with just some thoughts from the panel about. We're always thinking about low-hanging fruit and things that are ripe for these kinds of multidisciplinary approaches. And I think with Will offering to fund them all and give everybody, a grant, this becomes more than just an idle exercise. But if you had $500,000, I know that was a little more than we were going to give away, right now. Where are the ready targets for these kinds of behavior change interventions? Where would you be thinking about? And I just wanted to maybe start with our speakers and those who have spoken and those who haven't.
Well, I can say one thing, and that is the issue.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, good, it moves. Thank you.
Oh, you got your Diet Coke, too.
Yes, and I worked hard to get it, and I got an extra one in my bag. This is a very healthy place.
Can I have the other one? Sorry.
How much will you pay me? No, I'm just kidding. Sure. Yes, no, you can have it. I was worried I wouldn't be able to get one tomorrow. I mean, I come at this again from a public health point of view, and I think we actually know a lot about effective behavioral interventions, and I tend to think that they generally have small to medium effect sizes. And we know a lot about how to do this, but the issue is reach. And you're calling it scalability, that's part of it. But it's like, how do we push this out into a broader part of the population so that the overall impact is greater? And so that's one of the reasons that, I'm very interested in your applications using smartphones, because I think that being able to use social networks, for example, to diffuse your intervention for you is one way that you can potentially get this stuff out so that it has more of a population impact. And we're going to try to do this in Birmingham with emerging adults, because again, I think that's a period of lifespan development that's been largely understudied. And it's a period where there's a lot of prevention opportunities, but there's also great risk opportunities to pick up all sorts of baggage that you may be stuck with the rest of your life, including HIV and STDs and bad health habits, et cetera. So that's the group I'm focusing in on now, is the 15, 18 to 25-year-olds. And they all use smartphones pretty much. We've looked at even within the urban young African Americans, and they are some of the early adopters of smartphone technology, and young people are in general. So for me, the issue is not to develop a new intervention, but to figure out how to adapt it so that you can diffuse it and have more population impact. Anyway.
So just to, again, provoke discussion, what would you suggest are particularly valuable targets? I mean, there's a lot of behaviors we could change, and even if we say, transition to adulthood or mid to late adolescence is a key time to minimize bad things and maximize good things, and we know what to do, we need to get it out there. What would you target?
Okay, I'm a psychologist with public health sensibilities, and I think your question fundamentally needs to be guided by the behavioral epidemiology of risk behavior patterns. And one of the things, for example, in psychology is that until very recently nobody wanted to study substance abuse. And yet if you look at the behavioral epidemiology of what's creating the most problems and the burden of disease in the kind of mental and behavioral health area, it's depression and it's substance abuse and tobacco. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. And so that's the kind of thing that I would start with, are the ones that are prevalent and have pretty nasty long-term effects. One way.
So just to try to be provocative, not to provoke you, but also, there's probably a reason that people shy away from those problems, and it's because they've seemed so intractable. But then there's this other movement afoot, to encourage people to do things that are good for them. So if you had a choice of stopping people from eating, designing an intervention to try to stop people from overeating or to increase their level of exercise, what should we be doing now? Should we be focusing more on these appetitive, positive kinds of interventions, or trying to eliminate these? Do we know enough to know that this might be a time to switch towards promoting healthy behaviors rather than trying to stop these addictive behaviors?
Basic behavior modification, you can't just stop a behavior. You've got to replace it with something else. I mean, something's going to fill the vacuum, and so you're trying to always do at least, two things at once. It's not like one or the other. But the other thing to be mindful of is that what gets presented on television and in the media and about these problems and what presents in clinics, those are your most severe cases. And so, if you take a population perspective on it, the bulk of harm and cost, for example, of alcohol abuse, is in the mild to moderate part of the population. And that, again, if you're trying to have population impact, you need to be more concerned about them than the ones in the tail that are more severe, who tend to gobble up all of our healthcare resources.
So you were asking about eating versus exercise. So to some extent, promoting exercise would help the eating behavior because it increases metabolism, it increases responses when the insulin cycle is challenged because the portions are too big or too fat or whatever. So there are a number of beneficial effects which, if you promote that, might counteract even some unhealthy behavior that are done on the side. Even if they're not prevented, you are basically countermanding them. So I think that that's an easier, and in fact, I was wondering about, when we were talking about diet in adolescents, it's the behaviors that regarding family and meals together are all regarding food, but the promotion of exercise might do as much in addition to those behaviors are obviously quite good and to be promoted, but promoting exercise on top of that might actually really help because it might allow people to feel better about themselves because of the exercise.
I want to pick up a little bit on kind of this notion of a lifestyle change versus kind of the binge of some kind of crash diet, and just introspection. Data point of one, myself. I remember reading on the internet at some point that it's easier to work out 6 days a week rather than 3 days a week, because with 6 days a week, you just wake up and you're going to go. Versus if I set a goal of 3 days a week for myself, every single morning it's a struggle to decide, am I going to go today or not? And it's just easy to say, well, today is the day that I'm not going to go to the gym. And, it worked for me for a couple of years. In fact, I would just go every single morning, which was definitely not the norm for me. And so I wonder, in kind of thinking about promoting healthy behaviors, either in exercise or in eating, if kind of promoting kind of a more regular, rigid kind of set of lifestyle rules, like you will go to the gym every single day, that's what you should aim for, or you should aim to never have more than half a slice of cheesecake or whatever it is. If that is actually more effective as kind of an instruction to people versus something like, well, you should aim to exercise 3 times a week, we're not going to tell you when, and you can choose those 3 times. It kind of sounds more attainable, and it sounds like maybe there'd be more take-up. I wonder if that's actually counterproductive. And I don't know if there have been any kinds of studies that test one versus the other. And I'm again thinking about automaticity and what I was talking about with implementation intentions, where there's a cue, you just do it, rather than having a negotiation with yourself about whether you're going to go to the gym or not every single morning.
Make the data point of 2 because I do exactly the same thing. I go every day, so that I don't have to question when I'm going to go.
I don't think that has, I don't, is this on? Is that on? I don't think that has real life implications. I mean, the majority of the population does not go to a gym and could not go to the gym every day. Do you know what I mean? To me, that's kind of, it's kind of an interesting intellectual exercise that, you could do as a research study, but I don't actually think either one is going to make a big dent in what happens in the...
I wouldn't propose telling people to go to the gym every day, but I'm thinking rigid rules versus kind of flexible rules as the real margin, because, obviously we're not going to get people to go to the gym 6-7 days a week.
So my sense would be that would probably be less effective, because it would, if you kind of just going from what I was talking about with the dieting and the rigidity, and then, you say you're going to do, I mean, you can look at what happens in the gym you go to at January 1st. Like, it's full until January 15th or the end of January, because people make these rigid resolutions and they don't stick to them. And then, so that's just my opinion. And I think it depends on the person and where they're coming from. And if it's someone who, I always remember one of my postdocs saying, for some people, they do physical activity because they feel good about it after they do it. It makes them feel good, so they're motivated. But for some people, it doesn't make them feel good.
Doesn't make me feel good.
Yeah, even afterwards?
Even afterwards.
Yeah.
I wish I could have read a paper or something instead.
Yeah. I want you to tell your story, because that may be, if you would be willing, because that may be something that there would be funds for at the university for doing something about.
You need a mic.
Sorry, I don't mean to put you on. Is that okay?
I was just talking to her a second ago, telling her that I moved into a private dorm, and I moved in like 2 months ago, and I've never talked about food, nutrition, diet, and body images this much as I have talked in the last 2 months. It's like they're talking about it 24/7. Last week, someone bought a scale. Now everybody's weighing himself. They go to the gym like nearly every day. If they don't go, they talk about not going to the gym. If they go, they talk about they should have gone longer to the gym. We know each other's weights. When we're in the kitchen together, we're talking about what we're eating, what we're not eating. So it's just like extremely obvious to me right now. And I found myself weirded out by it, talking about weight and scales and body images so much. And it does affect you.
And you're
like
the supervisor?
No, I just live there, but I'm like the oldest person. Like I'm a grad student, they're all freshmen. And I did a paper on pro-ANAs, which is a group of people who are anorectic by their free will. Like they kind of love being anorectic. That's what they say, at least. So they're very serious about it. They have online forums about it. They check in there every day. It's kind of a subculture. And so I know the topic, but even me like living there, being together with them all the time, it affected me because just everybody's talking about it nonstop.
Yeah, I want to make a few distinctions based on the literature. I don't know if this will, it helps me to make some distinctions in what you all have been talking about. Number one, there's the issue of habit in the old sense, as in Skinnerian habit kind of thing. Obviously, we know a lot about habits and reinforcing habits and how habits can support. There's, that wonderful quote from William James, give me an individual, and if I can form a habit, I can change all of the things we've been talking about. It's a lovely quote, if only it were true. It is to some extent true, however. So habits, mindless, associationist, non-deliberative habits do have an effect on behavior. People can become conditioned. In addition to that, there are other sources of variance. There is, what I think part of what you were saying is to deliberate each time in a reflective manner is not necessarily good. I would agree with that. To me, that's a distinction between deliberation and intuition, a kind of automatic, what I would call gist space, what other people would probably call other things, this notion that decisions that tend to be successful and healthy are not ones necessarily that you weigh the pros and cons each time you make the decision. But an insightful, as the Gestalt psychologist said, an insightful decision or behavior is different than a mindless association habit. So these are two different mechanisms to support what might be, and I'll introduce another concept, a policy. So in other words, rather than remake decisions every day, what we often do as adults, as opposed to young people, is rather than weigh the pros and cons and begin anew every day our life, we develop certain policies. I would argue that a policy that has insight behind it is probably more sustaining than one that is only a habit, although habits can help you too.
And how does that, so what was your recommendation?
My recommendation would be to go to the empirical literature and to draw this very much. I mean, I think many of us were struck in the audience by the amount of commonality that the different groups could have, but that people that are doing a lot of the practical, important work on the front lines, that, beginning to integrate these well-known concepts from the literature. How much of this is habit? How much of this is insightful intuition that behavior change is supported? Which one is more efficacious? I could imagine some descriptive studies at first where we tried to separate out these different mechanisms for people's personal policies. Some descriptive survey studies could be done right away that could try to break these apart instead of conflating them all together. And then I could imagine some very, straightforward, theoretically driven experiments you could do to test some of these things. Just bringing these two literatures together, I think, would be an accomplishment. I think this sort of notion of personal policy might be a nice theme.
So I agree. I think it would be a wonderful thing to bring these literatures together and try to synthesize some of the many decades of learning from the psychology literature and sort of bring it to the design of some of the experiments that are being sort of tried into the behavioral economics world. So in addition, though, part of what I'm hearing is that in some contexts and for some types of behaviors, we want sort of rigidity versus flexibility, et cetera. But it may be that for some individuals, and I don't know whether it's sort of personality or something about their sort of emotion regulation, et cetera, but different people are going to be activated by very different types of sort of nudges and sort of interventions. So whether we're talking about carrots versus sticks, whether we're talking about money versus some other kind of sort of psychic reward, whether we're talking about rewarding an individual versus rewarding a team and activating sort of social networks. So different people are going to respond very differently to all these. And when we're designing individual interventions that we're testing, we rarely have the luxury of being able to sort of test who exactly this is activating, because we often don't have big enough sample sizes to be able to do also the subgroup interactions. But I think the more that we can bring some ex ante sort of hypotheses and theories to who it is that we think is going to be activated most by different types of interventions, start to test those hypotheses, and then start to sort of use those as we are designing more sort of targeted interventions. I think that's, to me, a very ripe area for moving forward. As you say, we know about a lot of different interventions, some of which work a little bit on different populations, but could we actually do much better by targeting different types of interventions at different populations?
Yeah, I would like to chime in here. I love the fact that we are starting to talk about individual differences, because so far our discussion has focused a lot on main effects, treatments that presumably work for everybody. And I do think that recent research provides us with at least some hints as to who are the people who would be particularly susceptible or who would benefit in particular from interventions. And I want to mention two factors that have been looked at. One is temperament. So there is a whole range of research looking at infant temperament and different styles of parenting leading to different outcomes depending on whether the infant has a temperament that is very susceptible to either a bad or a good parenting style. And then you have infants who are, not very bothered either way. So this and this is one example. I also want to mention another example where Bob and I and a bunch of other amazing collaborators have done some work in talking about genetic differences in terms of we all carry certain genes. We all have certain we differ in the genes we carry, and there are apparently some genotype variants that are linked to some of the important neurotransmitter systems like dopamine, serotonin. And it turns out that some people with certain gene variants are very susceptible to the influences of the environment, either bad or good. And then there are other people who are not who are not susceptible at all. And Bob hates it when I use the metaphor, but I'm going to do it anyway. So some people have compared people with some of these genetic variants that are very susceptible to orchids who blossom when there is, appropriate light and nutrition and water and all of that, and who really die when any of these things are lacking. And in comparison to that, you have the dandelions who are people with more robust genotypes. They are pretty immune against both positive and negative things, but they also never be as beautiful as the orchids. And there's some... See why Bob hates this metaphor, because of course everybody wants to be an orchid and nobody wants to be a dandelion, but the truth of the matter is that there's place for for all plants under the sun. And but if you want to look for people who would benefit particularly from an intervention, why don't we look at those who are maximally susceptible? And there's some emerging research looking at this genotype that we've been focusing a lot associated with the serotonin system, that children, for example, with this particular orchid genotype profit the most from cognitive behavioral therapy. And I would imagine that you could see similar, heightened gains for other kinds of interventions. And so I would be very excited seeing more research tapping into these factors.
Orchids and dandelions, they have phenotypic characteristics that are easy to observe and that we can target very easily. So is there literature which is matching those genotypes to particular phenotypes that we could sort of use at a lower cost to target?
Yeah,
that would be really interesting research if it's been done to summarize, if it hasn't been done to do it.
It's really very easy to screen people's genotypes. You just spit in a cup, and then you can actually analyze this DNA. And if you have some idea as to what some of the candidate genes are, you'll be able to know, are you a dandelion or are you an orchid?
Well, we can do that for an N of 50 in a small study, but we want to be able to match that to the phenotypes for the scale-ups, right?
Yeah, but this is really a very low cost thing you can do. I think it costs a couple of dollars to measure this one particular genotype, for example. If you wanna add that on, I think Bob, maybe you wanna tell us a little bit more about what we've done in Bob's lab is really look at the available samples that we had in the lab, and some of the studies started over 20 years ago, and we went back and collected saliva samples from these participants, and they were happy to give their saliva, and that gave us an enormous amount of information on all sorts of genes that they carry, and that has really helped us understand so much in terms of the lab results and the observations we had about these people. So this is really a low-cost thing that I think could prove to be really, really interesting.
Well, let's think about it in that broader sense. I mean, we're always talking about matching treatments to individuals. I mean, in every area of behavior change that I can think of, that's been sort of the holy grail. So like in psychotherapy research, you know, you do a study and some people just really do well with psychoanalysis, and some people, you know, don't get any benefit. And I think it's probably the case that if you do one of these nudge interventions, that some people just don't take the bait and others do. And, you know, is this the holy grail, or is this something that really is achievable? I mean, is it reasonable to think about ever being able to account for that variation? Obviously, Claudia has made the strong case that maybe you could account for it, but I'm wondering if others might think that this is just random noise, and we would be better off designing high-powered interventions that are going to work for most of the people most of the time. After all, individual differences, you know, is really a peculiar thing that's part of psychology. But I think in most other fields, what you're really interested in is not that, you know, that's the noise. What you really want are the things that are going to work for most of the people most of the time. So I guess the question is, how appealing is this? How much traction is there, you know, do we envision? And would this be a good place to spend part of our efforts at Berkeley, where we actually have a lot of psychologists who sort of believe in this?
Yeah, so when you were talking, I was thinking from a public health perspective, we're usually thinking, well, what's going to do the most for the most of the population and do the least harm? So I'm just going back to the exercise and, you know, the kind of, okay, do it every day. And maybe for some people that will be helpful, and for some people it won't be helpful, and for some people it will be harmful. And we know that it is harmful for some people if they tend to be more compulsive. They'll take it to an unhealthy extreme, like you were saying in your dormitory. So in that case, it does make sense to me that you'd want to know for whom and for how many, what percent of the population it might be harmful. But usually I'm thinking with a public health message, okay, what's the message that's going to be the most effective with the least amount of harm?
Yeah, and it's ironic because as soon as I heard your talk, the first thing I was thinking is, I bet you there's a subset who actually benefited from that diet, and you know, and rather than throw out the whole you know, the baby with the bathwater, maybe we should parse the population. But I think that's a difference of traditions, and
because whenever we have psychologists on our team, they immediately want to look at interactions. That's like.
As we think about sort of personalized medicine, right? Increasingly, personalized medicine is interacting with public health. Right? Public health, you know, traditionally we haven't sort of thought about that. But increasingly there is sort of this movement towards having better targeted interventions in all kinds of different ways. And if we can think about personalized behavioral change in some sense, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to get there down to the level of the individual. But I think that there's a lot of promise here.
Well, I actually think it's at odds. Sorry, then I won't keep talking. But I actually think many times it's I mean, sometimes it is, but many times it's at odds with public health, the personalized medicine.
Before we go any further, I was just going to suggest that one of you, so we have everybody on board, just talk a little bit, give us the quick primer on what personalized medicine means, because I don't think everybody knows exactly what you're talking about.
So personalized medicine can mean a lot of different things. I mean, it can mean actually having sort of genetic tests and, you know, targeting those individuals who are going to benefit from this particular sort of, they have this particular breast cancer variant, and so we're going to target this particular treatment at them. And that's sort of a very high-end, sort of very small slice of the population that's sort of expensive. But the broader notion as people are applying it to public health is not the genetic testing, right? It's the idea that we are going to be trying to target certain types of interventions more to some phenotypes, and you know, that's sort of what we're talking about here.
All right, now let's throw it open again. Yeah.
Yes, I think that to the extent that we are interested in kind of heterogeneous treatment effects and personalized treatment and so on, I think that really does argue for massively scalable interventions because you know, they're just a power issue. Right? If we cannot, so it clearly takes a lot more statistical power to detect these heterogeneous treatment effects. And so if we can't scale the interventions past 100 people or 200 people in a study, then I don't really see how just epistemologically we would ever be able to identify these heterogeneous treatment effects in non-scalable samples. And so I know the psychologists love to do these interactions, and I guess as an economist who's maybe not as steeped in that tradition, I look at those interactions and I think, multiple hypothesis testing, type 1 error, underpowered tests. And so I always kind of feel a veil of skepticism kind of go over my eyes when I see a lot of these interactions on sample sizes of 100. So that's just kind of my perspective, that for a certain class of interventions, we will never realistically know because we just can't collect the sample size.
But if you could, would you want to know the answer?
If we could, I would like to know the answer, but I think we have to have some kind of very strong ex-ante hypothesis that these interactions are large, because if we think that they're pretty subtle effects, then A, maybe it doesn't matter that much, and B, if they're subtle, again, it just takes a huge amount of sample to detect those effects.
So one of my favorite examples to make to hit on some of the points that we were discussing that I think captures at least some of the dimensions of how to use science to bring together these different elements is the story of skin cancer. Okay, so let's and the nice thing about skin cancer is that for the main exposure issues for skin cancer, the issue that Will raised about the phenotype as well as the genotype is so evident. We know, but even more importantly, we know the mechanism that UV light is the source of the problem. And 2 bad sunburns before the age of 5 increases your risk for skin cancer. And because we understand the mechanism, we understand, of course, there's genetic risk, that it's different. And of course, if you have high genetic risk and you live in Australia where there's an ozone hole and all the sunlight, then your risk for skin cancer goes up. But it's not deterministic or personalized medicine. It's a very simple public health approach of using sunscreen and protective clothing, and a culture change where nobody in Australia would send their kids to school without a hat on and protective clothing. It would just be abhorrent that you would do that to your child. It's a terrible thing to do. So you have this massive behavior change that extends over much of the world about using sunscreen, a behavioral change, because we understand the mechanism of the risk. And of course, some individuals that are at greater risk, but it doesn't go counter to public health. I mean, everybody is at some risk with enough sun exposure. So no matter how dark your skin is, using some sunscreen would be a healthy thing to do. But it also brings us back to the point is, where can we use science to have a deeper understanding for leveraging behavior, so that even if we have 12 different opinions about the best way to change the behavior or sustain the behavior, that we have some extra leverage. And the other half of this is, where is there science where we can advance the understanding by having a deeper understanding? Is it targeting the habit system at a particular point in development for a certain high-risk group? Where can a really bright group of people integrating across levels shine the light to advance our understanding, not necessarily just at a mechanistic level, but in some deeper level that then informs targets, whether it's the timing, whether it's the high-risk group or the context, that's broad enough that we can say, yeah, let's try to push the system or pull the system at this way or scaffold the system at this time. And if we can nudge the behavior at this time, we're going to have a bigger effect. And I think those are the kinds of things that are exciting to talk about. Where is there some resonance? Where do things start to sing a little bit like, wow? And of course, my examples are going to be adolescent, because that's, I think there's a lot of convergence about how some of these systems are very, very flexible to negative trajectories and positive trajectories at adolescence. But I think there are other examples like that. And in fact, part of the birth of this behavior change research network was after there was a big NIH focus on how important Val was at that conference. And it was interesting. There you brought together 50 people, 30 famous experts in behavior change, and trying to find convergence. Like, where are the exciting... I mean, it was quite an interesting process. And it was after that initial thing that we formed, well, Berkeley could think about these issues. Where are the sweet spots where where science could advance what kind of behavior to change? Because we do have intuitions about, what would be doing more good than harm, and ways we can, promote positive behavior or diminish negative behavior. But I think it comes back to, where is there some places where science could test our intuitions in more powerful ways for these leverage points?
So just to be more specific about, you talked about a population, I want to talk about an intervention. I come back to my earlier comment about incentives. So in what cases, what types of people are going to be particularly responsive to incentives as a motivator for behavior change, in what kinds of contexts, what kinds of behaviors, and what kinds of people and contexts and behaviors are they actually damaging, right? So we know a little bit about that. But I would argue we know far too little about the context when we talk about behavior change in health, and that's where some of my work is involved in sort of using incentives, and this is where I'm constantly bumping up against these the very little knowledge actually about we're worried there could be these problems with destroying the intrinsic incentives, but.
So are there some themes emerging about what people are thinking at this point about where it can be counterproductive, actually diminishing intrinsic motivation, and where it seems to be getting traction? I mean, from especially the cash transfer kinds of programs out in the real world settings that like where you're working. Is there even a intuitive sense of what seems to be more promising and less promising?
In terms of where it's actually harmful, I'm not hearing a strong evidence-based intuitive sense. I hear a lot of people who have discomfort with using incentives, but I don't see the evidence base. I don't see the mechanism sort of being tested. Really, can we convince ourselves that these are the situations where this is sort of really, really harmful? Right? I want to not talk so much. I'll let other people.
Just for the sake of argument, since we're doing that now, I really want to challenge this intrinsic-extrinsic motivation partition because I think it's partly specious. And I think that when you talk about extrinsic motivation, it means that you can find what you think the proximal motivation is in the recent context, when perhaps the intrinsic motivational cause or whatever just simply means that behavior is organized over a longer temporal interval, and it's motivated by other kinds of forces that you aren't necessarily observing right then in that discrete choice. So that is not, I know that's a very popular social psychology notion about undermining intrinsic motivation and so forth, but I don't like that partition, and I think it's more useful to talk about, taking that broader view on how the time horizon over which people are making choice and organizing behavior. And this is kind of off to the right, but you're talking about this whole issue of market segmentation, to use a public health term, about trying to figure out what interventions are going to be taken up by certain groups, and then of the ones that take it up, which ones are going to benefit from it. And I heard a recent talk by Susan Murphy at the other companion meeting, the Mechanism of Behavior Change group that meets every year with the Research Society on Alcoholism group. Mitch is part of that, I'm part of that. And she talked about, okay, turn off the mic. That's what they did at that NIH Science of Behavior Change thing. I was there too.
You had 3 slides and then the
Boom.
power went off, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize you guys were there, but that's good. I was there too. But she has a technique which is called an adaptive treatment design, a SMART design, which is sequential assignment, sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. And so what you're doing, you're partly answering your question empirically. And so, for example, to use this IVR stuff that I do, you would go ahead and start everybody at a low incentive and just see who did it anyway, for whatever reason. Because, our data suggests that if you do it for those that are somewhat poor risk for moderation drinking, they're going to benefit from it and have a better outcome. But you watch that for a while, and then you get to a choice point where your non-responders, based on some, easily identified empirical criterion, they are reassigned to other kinds of intervention. It's a form of looking at stepped care. And I think that is really a lovely design, and she says you should do this before you do a randomized clinical trial. A lovely design to begin to get at the whole, market segmentation issue. So, for example, in the research I'm doing, the non-responders, the people that aren't using the IVR in the first couple of weeks, well, I just pay them more. I mean, that's one way to incentivize the use of that thing, and then you can find out if exposure and utilization of the IVR actually has a benefit or if there's some other third factor going on there. But I think we've really got to get away from, and it's a typical psychology point of view of finding a strong intervention that is going to have a big effect because it's expensive, and it's hard to do that with very many people when you do that. And I guess I'm arguing for heterogeneity and diversification of intervention options so that it's better allocated across the population, because some people are going to need that thing that you're talking about that's strong. Many will not.
May I float an idea on this? I wasn't going to say anything till tomorrow because I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, a speculative suggestion that I have in this direction. But one thing that I respond to very strongly when I hear kind of many ideas here is that one thing that some of the research I'm going to talk about tomorrow, I think, suggests is that one way of increasing the kind of the impact and the scalability of a behavioral intervention is by instead of, it feels as if we have these multiple behavioral kind of issues that we kind of study individually, and that one thing that we can do is by increasing the amount of cross-theorization across these different interventions, think about, or these behavioral problems, think about what types of underlying what kind of underlying decision-making kind of theory or problem suggests a common kind of behavioral feature that's leading to all of these different behaviors. And then instead of individually targeting each of these different kind of behaviors with interventions, with specific interventions, instead of nudging problem by problem, trying to instead nudge the endogenous framing that decision makers make when they face each of these problems individually. So for example, if we think that there are a set of problems that have kind of intertemporal decision-making commonalities, right? So, there's obviously very, very rich kind of intertemporal features of dieting, smoking cessation, unsafe sexual behavior, retirement savings, and kind of savings behavior. Some of what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow is it possible that there are nudges which, instead of nudging any particular one decision that has an intertemporal component, instead nudges people to kind of frame endogenously for themselves intertemporal decisions more broadly in a different way, and whether or not that then can have, in some sense, even though it has very small effects in any individual kind of setting, actually, contributes to scalability and power by having an effect across a wide variety of scalings. And one thing that I think that suggests is that an increase in theorizing as to what are the common elements of behavioral problems across a wide kind of family of behavioral issues may be one way to gain a tremendous amount of leverage, even if individual interventions have weak effects in individual settings.
Are there any examples to share about, sort of poster children that really illustrate that point?
Sorry.
Or is that tomorrow?
Yeah.
Or is that tomorrow?
Well, I can I mentioned intertemporal because that's one of the things I'm going to focus on tomorrow. But what I'll just kind of preview it a little bit. So what I find is that you can think of it as a nudge, a relatively small nudge, which kind of encourages decision makers to think of their future selves as on relatively equal ground with their present selves, can have very, very strong cumulative effects across settings like savings, smoking, safe sex, obesity, exercise, all of those different things. And there appears to be some kind of relatively small interventions that in any one of these settings has had an effect. So for example, I think Hal Hirschfield's work, many people of you probably know about it, but these relatively small interventions where he presents an aged picture of you, a digitally aged picture of you, in the corner of, say, like a 401k enrollment form, or any kind of a decision point where you have to make a future-oriented choice. Just taking a photograph of you and kind of digitally aging it seems to have relatively large interventions. I think it would be interesting if we think, a potentially interesting way forward is that if we think that many other issues behavioral issues have intertemporal features that, like, some low-hanging fruit is moving interventions that have been found to work in one of these areas into others will both help us increase our kind of theoretical understanding of those commonalities. And also, I mean, in some sense, it's just, the ultimate low-hanging fruit, kind of cross-talking across disciplines and interventions.
Yeah, that was really helpful.
Yeah, and also thinking about, someone said this before, like when, in the questions, I was just writing down the different behaviors we've talked about, and then we talked about adults and adolescents, and then we talked about, you talked about the moderate versus the total rigid approach. So don't diet at all, or don't drink at all, or, exercise every day versus kind of gradual changes and what might be more successful, and what are the commonalities and the differences across behaviors and between adults and adolescents, and they may be between different segments of the population. It may be different. That's just kind of a very broad thought, but it may lead to something, given the different disciplines and the different areas.
Yeah, and just to follow up again with some of the things that people have said, a lot of times we throw out lab work as just not being relevant at all to the real world. And I think we've gone a little too far. And this is just to follow up on the mechanism argument. Mechanism is so important. Having evidence about mechanism, instead of grasping at straws and just correlating everything with everything, and in there somewhere is a signal. And if you start with a hypothesis that's grounded in data that's been rigorously gathered, you really up your prior probability of success. So, we talk about, and again, I don't want to trivialize the incredible creativity and effort that has to be put in to go from lab to life. We don't want to trivialize that in any way. That's a whole other science to itself, implementation science. It's very important. But starting where there's reality and data as opposed to nothing, speculation, stereotype, anecdote, data is it's so much better than that. It gives you so much leverage on the problem. And to give you a little hope, if you think about the things that we know now as laws of human behavior, physics has laws, psychology and human behavior also have laws. And some of them were discovered with one subject with nonsense syllables, and they're some of the most robust laws of human learning that there are. So those, that negatively accelerated forgetting function that Ebbinghaus discovered by memorizing nonsense syllables, and he was the subject, that same negatively that forgetting curve where you give an intervention to someone and they forget most of it right away. That's still true, and it generalizes across all kinds of content. I could give you lots and lots of others, and they were demonstrated in the lab what's more artificial than nonsense syllables? They were designed to be artificial, right? So and now, again, there are other kinds of learning, and what people did is they reacted to those by saying, what about stories? And meaning and stories matter, and there's these two kinds of learning. There's the kind of cognitive learning with insight, and then there's this sort of memorizing it kind of learning, but that turns out to be true too. So I would say at least start with the mechanism. We're so now into everything in the laboratory is irrelevant. At least start there. I think it would give you leverage on the problem.
So just sort of relating what you were saying to sort of what sort of Keith was saying, in the developing country world, there's actually this whole initiative now on sort of attacking problems such as HIV through structural interventions, right? And so structural interventions has meant something like attacking economic fundamentals, providing sort of more cash to targeted groups, helping them relieve some of their sort of budget constraints. But the sort of largest structural intervention that we always talked about is education. And increasingly, there's a group of folks who are saying, well, it's not just sort of general education, but we can do better than that in the short run. So we can be trying to teach very specific cognitive skills. And I presume that there's some large literature in the US which has looked at this already that we should be looking at. So from the perspective of cross-fertilizing across, instead of just focusing on one disease, cross-fertilize what we can learn from one disease to the other, but targeting those sort of upstream skills. Is there something there? Is there a sort of promising research agenda that we could have in really taking what we know and really pushing forward and trying interventions on general cognitive skills that will target adolescents, for example, and look across many, many different domains of their behavior? I'm assuming this is an active area, but I just don't know, so I'm looking at others.
I actually have an example for you in the behavioral economics literature. Warren Bickel, I mean, one of the key target things is how do you lengthen the discount rate? I mean, how do you get people to be more planful and not be such steep discounters? And he's published some papers that working memory training will have that effect, and it will have actual effects on clinical outcomes to do that. And this goes back to, you know, what you were talking about just a minute ago, about future selves and about being able to span that temporal gap between present behavior and future outcomes. I mean, I think that is a potentially kind of core process that cuts across many of these, quote, impulsive behaviors that we're talking about here today and trying to do health promotion with people as a starting point. And the other thing that relates to that when you're talking about, you know, how do you do things that cut across more than like one target behavior? A lot of these behaviors are complements to one another in the economic sense. If you do one, you're more likely to do the other, and people are increasingly talking about risk behavior bundles, that, you know, certain things, they're naturally occurring behavior patterns that are more complex than one problem that travel together. And so, you know, if you can reduce one, the argument would be that that should also have, you know, some positive benefit for all of its complements. Anyway.
I was just going to make that comment. I think that translational science piece is so important, though. I recently got some comments back on a paper I submitted, and the comment that literally came back was, because I was advocating for, we have all this evidence that says that we should improve the way that we do health interventions. And they basically said, the comment literally said, we have hundreds of thousands of articles that say that our current education system in the United States does not make any sense, and yet we continue to do it. So why is this any different? And I think that that's a really interesting thing for us to think about. I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence. There is a lot of evidence, and the evidence is really important, but how to then translate that into public policy and into programs. And I'm still a little stuck on the idea that we know how to change behavior in an effective way. Like, I think we're still really grappling with that, especially at these various intervention points and with different populations of people, that I don't know that we do know how to change intervention in a good and in a sustainable way, because otherwise I think we would have figured it out a long time ago. But I think that piece about how do we move the knowledge into action is really an important place to look.
Sustainability, we can change behavior.
Right.
The issue is, how do you maintain it?
Yeah.
So one of the themes, it's not going to surprise people who know me well on this direction, is that, and I'm trying to pick up on a couple of the other ideas about sustaining behavior change and ways to do that, and the problems with just educating people or just skill development. And that is, I think we overvalue the cognitive processes in a narrow sense, or just that it's reward value, and estimate the complexity of these affective systems, and that human affective systems are fundamental not just to emotion regulation, but to motivational feelings. And systems that shape motivational feelings, and I agree with you that intrinsic, extrinsic framework, when Will and I were talking, I actually don't even like to use those terms. On the other hand, we had a whole conference, we had Ed DC focusing on motivational learning, again, wrestling with this issue. What are the patterning of behavioral learning sequences that promote enduring change and motivation, leaving intrinsic, extrinsic aside, versus extrinsic reward sequences that do undermine enduring motivation? I think, leaving those old frameworks aside, there's some really interesting questions about what's the configuration and patterning of learning that change motivational feelings in ways that can have really enduring effects. And I think this comes back, my bias, not only in terms of thinking about affect in this deep way, but periods of development when particular components of affective systems are naturally being reshaped. And again, thinking about Adriana's presentation today in terms of thinking about this flexibility and adaptive versions of risk-taking and the different affective components of that, and this idea that, and it gets back to self-relevant affect. I mean, so when you talk about weighting the individual face with being old, what feelings does that activate differently for someone when they're trying to weigh this future low probability of some negative thing happening? When you can see your own face aged, I mean, how does that add different affective components? And so I think that going back to Will's question and this back to this idea of how do you create enduring change, I think one of the things we can say is that we should not equate education, giving people more knowledge, as being very close to changing behavior in any enduring way, and that there is a pretty strong signal that changing some of the affective links to these computational processes may be a more effective way. And I also want to get back to what Val was saying. I think trying to start from a base or a foundation where we have really strong science or some hypotheses about mechanisms. If something unique is happening in some period of development or in a subset of people, I mean, if we have a solid science story to leverage, it seems to me it gives us extra power. And I'm a clinician at heart, and I'm in public health, and I think that trying to get out there in the real world and make a difference is what matters most. But there's so much exciting new science that I think could be leveraged. And I think having groups of people thinking across these levels is really, it's an exciting opportunity to be thinking about where is the emerging science that gives us models for informing what kinds of hypotheses about opportunities for changing behavior in an enduring way. And again, I default to adolescence and affect a lot because that's where my examples, they're the attractors for what I think. But I think there are going to be others. And, Bob's made a really compelling case over the last couple of years about the transition to aging, having similar changes across every level, from neural systems to affective to social role to social identity, and the same convergence of multiple changes across systems that create this inflection point. And I'm sure there's great science that you've talked about. And so I think part of what we're going to do with the brainstorming session today and tomorrow is see what are the attractors? What are the attractors that pop up with a diverse group of people, like sitting around this table, where 7 different people go, yeah, that's a really interesting place to try to focus the light if we want to have, do some science that really can move things forward. So again, just really curious, people nominating attractors, ideas that seem like they interface with a few parts of this. I really like the comment. It was a great example. You could just watch the room when you made your example, like, oh yeah, low-hanging fruit, that if you could nudge the system in this way for infratemporal choice, this could have, and what if you did it in adolescence? But when they're just beginning to have sense of self, they can extend into the future in this way. So I think these are the kinds of examples that are really exciting to discuss in a group like this. So.
Are there data to suggest in reduction of like smoking or something like that? Do you know if that would show the same type of images of the effects of smoking on your physical attractive level? Or does anyone know if there are data that speak to that?
Well, I don't know, but and I can't speak to any studies, but we know that within certain neighborhoods, where if you grow up in a culture, if you're a poor black male growing up in an urban area and you're not thinking future, and you don't have those role models, you are more likely to engage in more high-risk taking behaviors. I can't cite the data, but I think that's. So,
but I'm just thinking in terms of the same, thinking about your future self and just in terms of physical attractiveness and like smoking and things like that.
I'll show some data tomorrow.
Oh, great.
About simple linguistic nudges that, and I have data from kind of 9 countries around the world where you can see some kind of persistent effects that, it's a little bit hard because it's repeated cross-section data as opposed to longitudinal data, but which appear to have effects that are cumulatively quite large by the time of retirement. So 13% chance of 13 percentage point lower probability of being obese at retirement kind of effects. But I'd love your feedback on this tomorrow.
There is a lot of work that was done years ago. It's not my work, but I'm probably not going to represent it as well as it could be, but there's work by Gerard and Gibbons and other people looking at the effect of different kinds of images, and there's also a lot of work that was in marketing that was basically experimental social psychology, looking at valence of images and that kind of thing on things like smoking. There's been a lot of work. Just to summarize some of it, so for example, it's not just the positive versus negative valence of an image. So you say, think of a smoker, and the person thinks of an image, and that image is to them positive or negative in valence. It's not just the valence. The details don't matter, actually. There's sort of again, this is one reason I find this appealing, it's more of a generic sense of who that is, not any of the details about individuals you might know that seems to predict behavior, along with other things like self-efficacy and other constructs. So there's some good work on this.
One of the things I found myself thinking about during the day, just to talk to Ron's point, was I guess it started with Adriana's talk, and that is that if there's one of the emerging messages from contemporary neuroscience is really that the way the brain works, there are these sort of go systems and these stop systems that actually develop as circuits, as complex circuits. And so the one she was talking about is kind of this cognitive control system that develops in the orbital frontal and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that sort of sits on top of these more phylogenetically ancient systems in the striatum and the old limbic system, and that this is kind of, as we move through life, these circuits mature in asymmetric ways. And interestingly, in adolescence and late life, there's a kind of in adolescence, kind of coming online, a strengthening of these control circuits, and then in late life, they actually weaken again. And so it suggests that the brain, that's the target of these interventions, is really tuned slightly differently as we move through life. And these differences get accentuated by disease. So when people have brain diseases like dementia, they often focus on one or the other. And so, I found myself thinking about it. So when you were talking about nudges today, you were mostly talking about these go systems. You were getting people to do things. You were kind of talking to the striatum and saying, this will get you some benefits, and you weren't really focusing on the stop systems. So it led me to, I just found myself thinking about that over and over during the day, that they probably are differentially receptive in different people, and particularly at different times of life. And so, when we're thinking about how to get adolescents to not engage in, to walk away from very attractive, compelling go kinds of stimuli, it's probably a very different kind of target than we're talking about an elderly person and we're asking them to do something like get ready for retirement. And maybe this is one of these ways that the laboratory could eventually create something that was exportable, that would help us fine-tune some of these scalable interventions in ways that would end up being more effective. We're a little bit away from it because I think that the metaphors don't really exactly match up, but there's no question in my mind that this is one of the great breakthroughs of neuroscience is the discovery of these circuits, these dynamics of circuits that now are doing very complex things, very different than the sort of the neo-phrenology of saying, well, the amygdala is the soul of emotion. That's yesterday's neuroscience. That wasn't very helpful. But now we're getting a sense of these dynamic circuits and how they change over time, and I think that may provide a much better handle for going up for exporting that to people who are designing interventions. So that was what I found. That was my hopeful thought for the day, and I normally don't have too many most days, but.
Just connecting to that thought, I think this differentiation between stop and go systems, that's really interesting, and it might be another example where we could bring adolescence and late life together. So the stop system, there's some indication that as we get older, we really are getting better at walking away from things and from people. There's some research suggesting that older adults are better able to disengage, and this capacity is actually linked not only to better well-being, but even to better physical health outcomes. And so I think if you understand a little better what enables and allows older adults to let go, and what are the specific strategies they use to stop doing some of these things or engaging in some of these behaviors that they can no longer do. I think that might be actually really helpful knowledge for applying that in adolescence, where we know this engagement capacity is really not very well developed. And
on the same ideas, one of the issues when we talk about sustainability of change is that the change you need to sustain is not really constant either. The behavior you need to sustain needs to change itself. So, for example, if we want to promote exercise and we are talking to adolescents, you will promote a certain thing. But that same adolescent, when he's 50 or 60 or 70, might need to scale down, even if it's become a habit or something that it's engaged in a more automatic manner because it's something that you live with and makes you feel good or whatever, needs to at that point scale down that same behavior. So the issue of behavioral change in aging is one that has strong affective components, because even if you have engaged in healthy behavior, weight management or exercise or what have you, for a good chunk of your life, there comes a point where your diet needs to change again, and maybe continuously at some point, and that your exercise needs to change. And you need to accept that and see the positive of that instead of seeing that, well, gee, I was skiing, double diamond slopes, and now I'm with my grandchildren on the green slopes or whatever, or the bunny slopes. So those are the kinds of things that I think have a strong affective component, but also one where the idea of sustainability is not really sustainable because there is that not just the affective part and the brain, and I'll talk about a little bit of these trajectories of brain regions that change at different rates during life, but it's also about the behavior itself that needs to be sustained or not sustained that changes.
Yeah, I think you get to a certain age in your 50s and your 60s, and all of the jocks who are exercising all their lives, they've blown out their knees, and now they're having to sort of give up on those things that used to be so healthy for them, and that can be really difficult. And so, I think it's a great point. I think the tale of life is one where you have to adopt the things when they're good for you and then let go of them when they're bad for you. And there are really a lot of things like that. And I think Claudia's point was there's a lot of research in gerontology that suggests that, that is a big part of old age, is really mastering that ability to give up on things, because you can't have everything, and some things start to hurt you that used to be very good for you.
Yeah, and in terms of intervention, that's something that needs to be taken into account, because when you talk about population intervention and epidemiology, you're targeting groups that vary widely in what they need. For some of them, something could be harmful or not acceptable, another is easily accepted. So I think that's an issue. Seat belts or cessation of smoking might be, or the sun example in Australia. Those are obvious things, but there are others where you need to have the right target to the right group. And unfortunately, interactions do exist, even though I'm a psychologist, so I like interactions.
Can't be bullied too much.
Well, I don't know how relevant this is, but I was just at a conference, and there was someone from Australia talking about vitamin D deficiency now among Australians because they've been so good about doing those policies.
Not enough sun, huh?
There seems to be some.
My name is Susan Hoffman. I'm the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC Berkeley. And one of the things, we have a public educational program that has 2,000 students, members, people over 50, from 50 to 100, who are taking courses and various learning offerings. But we're also doing research. And one of the things, we've got a kind of behavior change issue, first in trying to get people in the door, which I'm not going to address right now. But the second is among the 2,000, 80% of them have advanced degrees. They've been very successful in classrooms. And so we're translating some of the neuroscience that says the best thing cognitively for people to do is to challenge themselves, do something new, and to do it in a varied way. So what we do then is we urge our folks in what they choose, what courses they choose to take things that they love, but also to take something that would be a complete change, a change-up. What would be out of character for you to take this course? And to really begin to cultivate the community within our program, where people are kind of engaged with each other about, okay, what are you changing up and doing? I mean, partly because we know that genuine learning happens when there's cognitive uncertainty. And oftentimes, we all like to be comfortable and stay in that area where we know what we know. Like, we invariably always get the physicists taking the science classes when I'm wanting to get them into the art classes, that kind of thing. So for us, that's been a difficult and interesting kind of road. The other thing, just since we've been talking about public health, is that I think learning, lifelong learning, has been a really underutilized public health strategy. Since we know that when people are genuinely learning, the impact on longevity is profound, that it postpones the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's, and unfortunately, that message is only reaching upper middle class white women who are well educated and between the ages of 65 and 75. So the message has got to get out there, in a much more profound way. And I think making it be relevant and fun, social engagement, have it be about things that are really important for older adults to learn. And we're finding in our over 80 folks, nobody's ever studied them, or asked them, what do they want to be learning about? And we're finding that they're most interested in the future. They want to know where technology's going. They want to know where big data is going to take us all. They're very interested around the impact around personalized medicine and the robot care, that kind of thing. So I think I think we're in an interesting time to think about how to change older adult behavior, because I think we can, and I think it actually will be linked to their cognitive health, the degree to which we can do that.
Any other thoughts or themes or?
I just had something that's sort of linked to that comment and then the discussion that was happening earlier about, there's also a very, whether it's affective or moral judgment on what risk-taking is okay. And for adolescents, we do a lot of, we want to stop their behavior, which then is later going to become okay. So you're not supposed to have sex now, but you can have it later. You can't drink now, but you can do it later. These things will be okay later. And then for older adults, they're then having to let go of some of the things that they are finding very important to them. And I think that affectively, that story is very difficult for them to sort of integrate that with their sense of self and how they're thinking about themselves. And I really appreciated the comment about using nudges to affect stop systems, because I think that the caution with that is that especially when we're thinking about adolescent behavior, we're trying to get them to stop. And people literally say, we just need them to stop and think for a minute. And really, that's not what we need them to do. And I know you're going to talk some about this, but I think that that's an interesting thing of what is that nudge? What are we trying to get them to do? We're trying to get them to stop but not think. Is really we need them to stop and just automatically go into this decision processing, which I think is really challenging. It's trying to define that and figure out how to do that, I think, will be a really interesting place. And I think there is a strong affective story that is supported by the neuroscience that's really unique for adolescents.
And suggests that they're not really wired up to do that.
Right.
Yeah, so we're really going against their biology. Is that part of your point?
Yeah, for sure.
Another way to think about that is you just want to keep them alive until they get to be about 25, especially if they're young men, so that these maturational processes take place, and you do not want them to pick up some lifelong baggage. And I forget some of the work that has been done on prevention suggests that almost all disorders really develop during that critical period, and that you want them to just survive it without picking up horrible things. And as someone who has just raised 2 teenagers to young adulthood, particularly with my son, it really was like a switch flipping at about age 24. And people kept telling me that was going to happen, and I didn't believe them. He was horrible. I don't know how he survived. And so part of what we may need to do for people in that age is not to think so much about internal cognitive controls and changing their systems as much as how do we structure environments during that age period so that we reduce the lethal risks, because they're going to take risk.
So let me agree with that and add at least a minor counter, which is that I think I totally agree that this is a really key time for adolescents to get through this period intact. But I don't think it's just about structuring society to keep them alive. I think, and it's not just keeping them from getting into deadly habits. I think that, and it's part of what Adriana was presenting really beautiful data about, they have to learn how. If we just create external constraints that protect them, they aren't developing this mixture of affective and cognitive abilities to learn how to navigate and find the alternative, healthier versions, to pause and do the less automatic behavior. It's a bit like saying, well, we won't let them use their muscles for 4 years, and then when they're more mature, they can get out and do things. They have to be using these systems. They have to be exposed to healthy risks and finding ways to have those exciting, thrilling experiences and novel experiences. And as someone said, that the learning occurs in situations of uncertainty. They throw themselves into uncertainty. That's where the maximal learning's occurring. But we want them to do that and find positive versions of risk-taking. It's part of what I think you were talking about. It can be incredibly exciting to take risks that are very pro-social. But as a parent, it feels deadly stakes when they're doing, because there's some really horrible versions of that. And of course, morbidity rates jump 300% from school age to late adolescence, and a lot of them actually die. But I think that this idea that we just protect them or keep them alive versus promoting positive versions of these, I think these it's not just semantics. I think, and it may be what you were implying anyway, that it's not just keeping them alive, but I think that is an approach a lot of people think, because we just need to seal them away somewhere and let their brains develop. And of course, as you're saying, just like muscle, these systems have to be exercising control learning in real world environments to get and again, I'm going to stop talking and let Adriana give a more.
Well, I was just going to say that it's just a question. Is it really just delaying the inevitable if you kind of, this idea, of locking them away or not letting them exercise the risk taking, right? And so I want to hear what Valerie has to say. Yeah. She's shaking her head.
You probably know about these. I mean, that's not what the data say. The data say there's a period of much, much higher risk, and that if you supervise, especially early adolescents, younger adolescents, the relationship between supervision and morbidity mortality is huge. It's not a glamorous variable, but it has an enormous effect on outcomes.
I agree. And this idea of scaffolding it's like what expert parents say. You want to give them enough independence to make some mistakes, but not deadly. But I think there's also evidence that the most protected kids are at increased risk. If they have too much external constraint during this period of time to not learn the self-control, there's, again, this complicated studies because other risk factors in those kids. But some of the kids that have done the least experimentation are...
Like Shedler and Manis. So like Shedler and Manis's study is one of them that showed that kids that had tried drugs, who had never tried any drugs at all, did not as well as the kids that had tried some and so on. But that's like one study, and they think it may have to do with the kind of cohort that was studied at the time. I would love for us to put our heads together about what the data actually show here, because there is that one study, but most of the other studies show exactly the opposite.
I think it's a Berkeley study.
One other quick example, and again, it's not exactly the same thing as the risk-taking, and I think the idea of scaffolding and monitoring is huge, a hugely positive thing from many, many studies. But I want to get back to the more general issue of the learning. In a very specific set of skills, which is driving a car. If you don't let, if you wait 1 year or 2 years, you get a little bit of a bump in the positive. But if you wait long enough, if you wait and don't let people drive until they're 30, they never become good drivers. And so I think it's an analogy to if we try to over-scaffold young people and not have them engaged in certain kinds of skill development and affective components of that, I think there's a good case that could be detrimental, even if it's protective. And what's the balance point? I think we need better science. We do need to get our heads together and say, what does the evidence really show?
I did not mean to imply that this was even possible, and I'm not recommending it. They're going to take risk. We're just going to have to accept that. But the issue is, can we have some kind of environmental enrichment for those in a certain risk segment where they actually have opportunities for risk-taking, because they're going to do something, but in a way that it is not going to immediately lead to something that is going to damage them or be lethal. And I know that some data suggests that one of the riskiest periods of time in an adolescent's day is between the time they get out of school and until the parents get home from work. And so we know a lot about the target interval where we really need to do some kind of environmental enrichment, if you will, or something to reduce risk and create other kinds of opportunities. And I think that, I guess I'm just encouraging thought at that level of intervention and to not put all of the burden on the adolescent or emerging adult to learn how to control themselves, because they're not going to do it.
So let me suggest a potential source of data for kind of driving our intuitions, although it may be for some relatively extreme, one extreme tale of behavioral issues. There's a very large literature in criminology about literal incarceration. They use some relatively interesting sources of identification. So, for example, in many states, there's a literal discontinuity. Like, you're going to be, if you commit this crime 2 days after your 18th birthday, you're going to be incarcerated for 2 more years than somebody who committed the same crime 2 days before their 18th birthday, for example. And I think that literature, this is obviously in a very different part of the distribution of behavior than we think of, but that literature does find certain behaviors like just sheer kind of just a very, very strong age effect that, like, post age 23, you're just much less likely to recidivate than, I mean, I mean, that's a potential. I'm not an expert in the literature. I have some knowledge of it, but I'm just suggesting it as a source of data that can actually drive some intuitions here, and for which we actually have some relatively good natural experiments.
All right, well, I think given it was a long day, and given that many of you who have teenagers now have to think about locking them up for the next 5 years, why don't we call it a day? And tomorrow we start again at 8:30 with breakfast, and then 3 speakers starting at 9. And those of you who are visiting and are guest speakers, we will be reconvening at 7 at the 5 restaurant, not 5 at the 7 restaurant, 7 at the 5 restaurant for dinner. And it's in a special room, so you might have to ask the host or hostess where our group is meeting. But we'll have people over there. So thank you all for coming, and thanks a lot to our speakers and to you.